Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C., where we are at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments to talk to Bryan Clark, who studies the Navy here, former commander, former submariner, former aide to John Greenert, who was the CNO. You and I have talked about the Navy's future frigate. Talk to us a little bit. You testified before Congress about that program, among other things. Talk to us a little bit about what the state of play on it is. And because there is some pushback from some naval analysts that the program is not quite what it ought to be.
Right. Well, thanks for having me on, Vago. What the Navy's done is they've released an RFI, request for information, to industry to try to get some ideas for the new frigate. And what they've asked industry to do is propose to them what might be possible within a set of capabilities that they've asked them to include in the frigate as potentials. And they haven't given any sense of cost or what the cost expectation is, but they've asked it for industry's ideas on what the frigate should be able to do. And the problem with that RFI, however, is they've opened up the aperture too much. So it could be anything from sort of what the LCS, the Littoral Combat Ship, does today, which is a relatively low-end mission for doing air defense of itself and surface warfare at a short range and ASW in some limited situations, all the way up to a full frigate which can do multi-missions, so surface warfare, strike warfare, ASW, and as well as air defense of other ships. So it could be anything from a low-end ship to a high-end ship, and they haven't told industry what kind of cost constraints they're under or what their limits should be. So I think industry is going to come back with a lot of questions as to what the Navy really wants. And I think it's indicative, as Ron O'Rourke said in the hearing last week, that we haven't done the analysis necessary to determine the capabilities needed in the frigate.
What are the capabilities that you think ought to be inherent in this design? Because there are some folks who are looking at this and saying that the U.S. Navy ought to be giving a lot more guidance to industry before doing this, especially when it comes to base requirements, and not have it be as general as more than 3,000 miles, because 3,000 miles, it means virtually nothing, because then by the time you have very little usable range before you have to hit the tanker again, to the oiler again to get gas. What are some of the base requirements you think, having studied this requirement, that this new ship is going to need to give it some future growth room, but also sort of the real-world capabilities and how we're likely to use these ships?
Well, the analysis that we've done and that we did for our fleet architecture study earlier this year indicated that what we need the frigate to do is to be able to do some of the missions we would use a destroyer to do today. So that would be air defense of another ship, anti-submarine warfare, and surface warfare, and in some situations, strike warfare. So it needs to be a multi-mission capable ship. And what we found in our analysis also was that instead of the Navy's approach, which is kind of a high-low mix where you've got highly capable large surface combatants like destroyers and then low capability small surface combatants like frigates, that you instead need a big-small mix. So what you need is frigates that have basically the same capabilities as the destroyer, just in a lot less capacity. So they'd be less expensive, and you could buy them in more numbers, but they're not going to be a cheap ship that's going to be vulnerable and a potential liability in combat. You also desperately need these ships to be able to do some of the escort missions that are going to be needed in even a conflict scenario, not just wartime, but even a situation like the tanker war that we had between Iraq and Iran, where we had to escort tankers going through the Persian Gulf. Today, we would have to use destroyers for that, and our destroyer fleet is very stressed because it's got ballistic missile defense, it's got defensive carrier strike groups that it's doing, and it's also doing things like counter-piracy. So to be able to relieve the destroyers of those missions, you need to be able to do all the missions a destroyer would do, not just be a low-end ship that isn't able to survive in a threat environment. So the frigate really needs to be a multi-mission capable ship with this ability to do air defense for a nearby ship. That's sort of the sine qua non of the frigate.
And you and I have talked about that. There are some folks who think that the ESM, the Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, is the right one for that. You and I have discussed that we don't think that's the right one for that, right? Because the range is too limited given the kind of fast-moving threats they're going to be. As you're looking at what should be sort of the base intellectual architecture that goes under this, are you talking about, say, 16 standard missiles, for example, and maybe another 16 ESSM, so that one is sort of the point ship defense system while the other one is able to project at least a certain degree of air defense bubble? Or do you need more VLS tubes than that in order to be able to have that kind of loadout that makes you operationally relevant?
What we found is that you need about 32 VLS cells in the frigate because you're going to be using a number of different configurations. So if it's going to be doing air defense for another ship, like in an escort role, then it would need to have probably half of the cells be SM2s because you will need to have the longer range missile, the faster missile to deal with some of the faster threats that we're encountering, the high-end supersonic cruise missiles, in the future even hypersonic weapons. ESSM is a very capable weapon and would be very useful against most of the cruise missile threats you have today. So things like the C-802 that the Houthis shot at the Mason, you could deal with that with an ESSM Block 2. But for some of the supersonic threats, you might have to shift to the SM2. So when a frigate is doing instead maybe an ASW mission, maybe its VLS loadout would be a little bit more ESSM focused. Maybe it would carry ASROCs so that it could do standoff engagements of submarines that it detects. So there's ways you could configure the VLS magazine to be able to focus it on the missions at hand, but still have that ability to turn and do missile defense if necessary or surface warfare if necessary.
What's the sort of timeline that the Navy is looking at in order to make a decision? Because this timeline has been a sliding one. I think that everybody, if you talk to them around surface Navy time, folks were looking at kind of a speedier decision. Let's just get base requirements. All the ship needs is, for example, ESSM. I don't think we have to get too fancy with this. Where do you think that timeline is now?
Well, right now the Navy is thinking about trying to start acquisition in 2020. That may still be possible if they quickly decide on the requirements, but it sounds like there's going to be some churn within the Navy as they decide really what they want within this large envelope of capabilities that they've asked for. And the RFI sort of indicates there's still a lot of uncertainty inside the Navy as to what capabilities they expect the ship to have. So they're going to wait for industry to come back, and I expect industry to come back with a pretty big range of things. So I assume some LCS builders will come in with essentially an upgraded LCS because that would meet the minimum requirements of that RFI. And then some will come in with a full frigate like you might see in a European Navy. And the Navy then will have to look at the cost of each of those platforms and then decide kind of where the cost capability trade-off happens, which is what they've implied by their industry day brief. The problem, I think, though, is that the Navy says they're trying to prioritize capability, but the way they've designed the RFI makes it seem like they've really prioritized cost because they've asked for, give me the wide range of capabilities and then how much those are going to cost. That would indicate to me that there's no clear minimum for a capability. It's more about how much money it's going to cost them to buy it.
Any more clarity about manning size? Because that is one of the reasons that drove us into the LCS, the Littoral Combat Ship mindset was, right. 2 years, $200 million, and very, very few sailors. Any feedback on that? And so let's take that first.
So the RFI asks for the responses to be able to accommodate 200 personnel, which is twice as many as the LCS carries. And it's more than even you would have on an Oliver Hazard Perry class frigate. So that's a pretty big complement. You probably wouldn't even have that many if you were actually building a full multi-mission frigate. So that's maybe a little bit at the high end, and then I would expect some of the proposals to come in and be at a lower number of people. But it's certainly personnel is one of the limiting factors right now in LCS because it constrains their ability to do maintenance, to man up as many stations as they might need to sustain operations for a longer period. So the 200 people, I think, is actually a good number. I'm just thinking some of the proposals back from industry may not actually hit that number.
And what about survivability? Because one of the whole things is, given the sophistication of ever better anti-surface weapons, there is a sense that almost no ship is really going to survive combat for very long. So ultimately, how much investment do you need in survivability, for example, if any of these modern, especially multi-sonic, hypersonic missiles are going to come crashing into your ship? Is it time to make certain trade-offs and apply an actual disposability? I mean, nobody likes to say that. It was a politically charged word for the Navy when it started discussing that, but that in contact, these ships, given the power of modern weapons, are going to be very, very vulnerable. So do you need to reduce perhaps the investment in certain traditional survivability features we might have that were designed in an era where you were more likely to survive than not what's going to be coming at us in the future?
So it kind of depends on the operational concept that the ships are going to execute, and this gets back to the point that the Navy not necessarily having done the analysis to support the requirements they've developed. So I think that the ship is going to have to incorporate some survivability improvements. So that what they've got in the minimum is that it would have at least one, possibly two CRAM launchers, and CRAM is a very effective counter-missile missile. It's very good against supersonic weapons. It would be pretty effective against most threats, but you've got a limited capacity. So the idea there is between the ESSM and the CRAM on the ship, and then potentially SM2s, you'd have the ability to defend against a pretty large salvo. And then the adversary is put in the position of having to decide how many missiles am I going to shoot at once at this ship in an attempt to take it out. And then it gets to the operating concept, because if you intend to keep that ship inside of a highly contested environment for a long period of time, well then obviously you've got to do something else to defend it. But if instead you think of that ship as being sort of a part of an initial force that would initially conduct operations and then withdraw as a fight starts, then that level of survivability is probably appropriate. So it gets back to the operating concept that, is this a ship that's designed to stand and fight in a sustained operation against a highly capable enemy? It's probably not. The frigates are not necessarily intended for that. So you'd probably have it stay for a short time and then leave as soon as it can get an opportunity to withdraw. So that its defensive weapons are really designed to support its ability to withdraw from the fight.
A last paired question. One is, what sort of combat system should it have? I mean, is this going to be, because, for example, the frigates were, it was part of NTDS, and they would get data feeds, which gave you a bearing, but not necessarily an altitude or some other things. And so you had to have a very good fire control party to do that. But, under a CEC environment where we are, how much capability does the ship itself have to have in order to be able to detect a cue? And then that's part one of the question. Part two of the question is, nobody ever defended their way to victory. So what sort of offensive punch, given that Admiral Tom Roden has spoken very eloquently about distributed firepower, and you guys have written extensively about that also, what should it be? What should we be talking about on the offensive piece of the equation as well?
So the combat system the Navy's asked for is the Combats 21 system, which is the Lockheed Martin kind of variant of the Aegis combat system, which they would put on whatever frigate they get. So there's lots of frigates that are out there that they could all accommodate that kind of combat system. In terms of sensors, the Navy said that they wanted to carry the Enterprise air defense radar or surveillance radar, which is a variation of the AMDR. So it's a very capable radar. And it's also got a passive sensing capability. Also, CWIP Block 2, which is what they've required to be on there, is also a passive sensor as well. So it's going to have a very capable sensor package, which it has to have, because one way that the Navy wants to operate this ship is as part of a distributed maritime operations, and distributed lethality is used as a sensor node. So it's going to be out there either passively listening for targets or potentially actively looking for them with its radar. But it'll be part of that sensor network that then maybe feeds information through CEC back to other ships that have a larger weapons magazine. So when getting to your question about offense, in our fleet architecture, we focused on every ship having enough offensive capability and defensive capability so that it could defend itself long enough to expend its offensive weapons. So the idea is the frigate would have enough offensive weapons in its VLS magazine or in its deck launchers to be able to conduct some anti-ship attacks or strike warfare as it's withdrawing. So the idea is it's going to launch its weapons, survive long enough to have launched its weapons, and get out of the area. So yeah, offense is important, and you just got to think about, how do I defend the ship long enough for it expend its offensive weapons in the initial phase of a conflict.
Bryan, thanks very much. It's always a treat. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Vago. Thank you.